everyone, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for a really exciting conversation with some terrific experts. We're going to be talking about how transparent is gender equality funding in Kenya and where do we go from here. And we're going to learn about some really in-depth research that was led by Publish What You Fund in partnership with a number of leaders in Kenya as well as globally to really understand what's going on with gender financing and how do we make sure that people have the data that they can use to really make a difference. We all know that gender equality is key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, to global peace, to prosperity. And yet we know that gender equality continues to be grossly underfunded. We've all heard exciting policy commitments about how we need to, from leaders, that we need to achieve gender equality and their commitment to it. But when we go to see if the funding is there, it's often hard to tell that story. So we're really excited today to be able to dive in deeply and learn about what is the gender financing picture in Kenya and how do we actually get a better understanding of this data and how it can be used to drive the change that people in Kenya want for themselves. So today I'm excited to introduce Jamie Holton, who's the lead researcher on this project and is going to start by walking us through some of the findings on this. And both on the project to map the national and international funding for gender equality in Kenya and to tee up the rest of our conversation. We encourage you all to be active participants in this conversation. You can submit questions using the hashtag gender financing, or feel free to use the Q&A function in your chat box. I also want to introduce Damian Evans, who's joined us this morning. He's a sign language interpreter from the Kenyan Television Network, and he's going to be helping make sure that this conversation is accessible to as many people as possible. You're also encouraged to turn on the captioning function in Zoom if that's also helpful to you. So with that, I turn it over to you, Jamie, from Publish What You Fund, to start the conversation with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nora, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. So I hope people will be able to see the screen. Just to flag, if people see the live transcript button, they can also enable live transcripts. So hopefully that will make it easier to follow along as well. So today's topic is how transparent is gender financing in Kenya. It's by the Gender Financing Project, which received support from Save the Children US and Plan International USA. And last week we published our Gender Financing in Kenya report. So we were very excited to go through some of the findings and key considerations with you today. I'm very excited to talk about these with our fantastic panel as well. So the first starting point is, why does Kenya need better gender financing data? And what do we mean by this? With gender financing data, we mean any financial or program information on gender equality work in Kenya. So this could be disbursements or commitments, funding towards gender equality, or more basic project level information. So any information on this. We asked a key amount of gender advocates in Kenya as to their satisfaction on the amount and quality of data that is publicly available on gender equality work in Kenya. And from our survey respondents, we actually saw that a majority of them were not satisfied with the available information on this. Most of the organizations that indicated as dissatisfaction were from Kenya-based NGOs, non-governmental organizations, women's rights organizations, international non-governmental organizations, INGOs, as well as research institutes. So the main issues they indicated with the available data is that it was not disaggregated enough, so it didn't have the amount of detail that would be helpful for them. It also was usually found to be outdated, not timely enough, so too old for them to make useful plans for their own gender equality work. They also found it was usually not disaggregated enough by gender, which would really allow us to track how this funding and how this work is affecting women and girls, or boys and men and other genders in different ways. And in general, we found that without access to this quality data on where funding is going, to whom and in which sectors, it makes it very difficult for key gender equality stakeholders to find funding gaps, to plan and implement programs to address gender equality, and for all of us to hold our international donors and governments accountable to their key gender equality commitments that they've made, and to help us track progress towards how we are moving closer towards achieving gender equality, and therefore SDG 5. So we also did some effort to track national spending towards gender equality. And from the available budget implementation reviews for 2018 up until now with the approved budget estimates, we were able to track funding to 3 key gender equality institutions in Kenya, as well as a key gender equality initiative towards free maternal health care in Kenya. Now, this actually ended up being about 0.3% of the overall budgets or spending by the Kenyan national government. And this is what we mainly think is due to a lack of gender responsive budgeting, or at least the implementation of the gender responsive budgeting marker in Kenya. So our analysis actually suggests that although the National Gender Equality Commission has created gender responsive budgeted marker guidelines, it actually isn't implemented at the moment by some of the national institutions or the ministry and departments. So that actually might mean that the government spending towards gender equality could be a lot higher. It's just that we're not able to track it using the available budget documents. Our analysis also suggests that we have a lack of disaggregated information, which makes it difficult to say how the Kenyan government is actually funding its national gender policies. So although funding might be marked to go towards gender equality, we're not able to have that level of information that would allow us to say how the funding is actually supposed to support certain national gender policies. We also found that there's a lack of gender responsive budgeting marking or gender filtering options in ePromise. Now, ePromise is the national government's aid information management systems, which would allow us to track national and international funding towards development initiatives in Kenya. However, at the moment, because of a lack of gender marking filter options, ePromise cannot be easily used to verify how national or international funding is spent to support gender equality in Kenya. So based on our analysis, as well as some recommendations by our key informants and our one-on-one donor consultations, we actually propose several key considerations to the Kenyan government to support their efforts to make their gender financing more transparent, because we found that there is a foundation to make this information very transparent and trackable. So our key considerations for the national government are to use existing tools and to potentially develop new tools and mechanisms to fill the gender responsive budgeting implementation gap, to improve the quantity and quality of gender financing that is currently available, and to really identify and meet gender advocates' data needs. We found in many cases that information that's put out is not always necessarily used by gender advocates, or gender advocates aren't necessarily aware of this information. So it would be really great if there could be a dialogue between these key stakeholders to understand what information is available and what information would be most helpful to help all of them work together. We also did some tracking of international donor funding towards gender equality. And within this breakdown, you can see that we first tracked general development assistance going towards Kenya, and then we tried to really break down how much of that development assistance is targeting gender equality. So our analysis suggests that of the total development assistance for Kenya in 2018, using OECD data, about a fifth of donor funding for Kenya is reported by donors to be dedicated to gender equality in some way. And only 3% of donor funding for Kenya has gender equality as the main objective, which is something we call principal gender equality funding. And if we break this gender financing down, we're also able to see some very interesting facts. So our analysis here suggests that most gender funding from international donors comes in the form of ODA grants. Most goes to short-term project-based work. Most gender funding from international donors is given to NGOs based in the donor country rather than in Kenya. Of the funding going towards key gender equality themes, based on the OECD's classifications on some of these themes, we found that less than 2% of the funding for 2018 of gender financing funding goes towards women's rights organizations, or WROs, or key government institutions working on gender equality, as well as ending violence against women and girls. And out of the 33 funded sectors for gender funding by donors, the most popular is reproductive health. And the most popular theme or subsector, you might say, is STD control. So working to work around HIV and AIDS. So we've noticed that from the available data, there's actually a few data issues when it comes to reporting practices by donors, and also just the structures of some of the databases that we've been able to access. And some of the inconsistent and incomplete reporting leads to a few very crucial questions. For instance, are donors aligned with Kenyan government's gender priorities? And if so, how can that be more apparent from the data that we find? Who are really the top gender donors in Kenya? It might be straightforward using one database, but if you look at other databases, for instance, the International Aid Transparency Initiative data, you actually might see that there was only one of the 5 top gender donors that coincided across the 2 databases. So this leads to a question of, is this just a matter of inconsistent reporting by these donors? Or is there other structural issues that are preventing more pictures that might be more harmonized? Then another question related to this is, how many gender equality projects are really being funded in Kenya? Looking at OECD data, we might find one number. Looking at IADI data, we might look at very different numbers of gender equality projects. And some of this might be due to the nature of the 2 different platforms and the timeliness of the information that's being reported by donors. On the other hand, there are some very big discrepancies that lead to questions as to whether there are different reporting practices within donor agencies that might explain some of these different numbers. Finally, and very importantly, we were having trouble finding out who these projects are really targeting. Are they targeting women, girls, adolescents? Are they targeting LGBTQ+ people, or for instance, gender-based violence survivors? So really specific gender groups and their additional characteristics that might make it very helpful for people to understand how these groups are being targeted with funding and projects, and in an effort to not make sure they're not being left behind and the most marginalized groups are being tended to through some of this work. We also found it difficult to track what efforts donors are making to not reinforce gender inequality. So for instance, we weren't able to find many gender analyses or gender integration approaches. And we also found it was very difficult to track what impact these projects are actually having. In many cases, results data is not available on donors' own websites or on the OECD website. And in cases where it is possible to report this information, for instance, to IADI, we found that those data fields were often empty or outdated, which meant that it was very difficult to actually assess how projects are really impacting gender equality in Kenya and how we are moving the needle towards improving gender equality. Now, there are a few things that are missing from the national and global data sets. For instance, we found it was very difficult to get a picture of local gender advocates funding and gender work due to, as they indicated, an insufficient capacity to collect, manage, and publish data. So this was due to a lack of resources or capacity. We also found that the impact of COVID-19 on gender financing is not yet fully apparent. It will take some time for this data to come out and to really allow us to understand how COVID-19 has shifted funding patterns. Other than that, we also found it was very difficult to track other actors' gender financing. So for instance, private foundations, humanitarian agencies, international non-governmental organizations, development finance institutions, and women's rights organizations. In many cases, the global databases do not accurately capture the wide scope of these organizations and the actual up-to-date day-to-day work that these actors do when it comes to gender equality. So based on our analysis, we offer some key considerations for donors to actually support local gender advocates to improve the local gender financing data picture. So we offer key considerations for donors to support local gender advocates' capacity to collect, use, and publish gender financing data. We propose different ways that they might be able to engage with gender advocates on their data needs to make sure that the information that they're putting out is really reaching these key gender advocates, and also in a way that is most accessible and helpful to them. And lastly, we propose that international donor agencies support their country offices in helping to identify these gender advocates' data needs and to meet them as well. We are developing recommendations for improved reporting by international donors for their own gender financing data. And we are developing this through consultations, and this will be published in our Global Transparency Report coming this summer of 2021. So thank you so much, Nora. This is it for my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for walking us through the findings and the research. And I think we're excited now to turn to a panel of experts in Kenya who are working to advance gender equality, who can talk about how these findings resonate with them, and more importantly, how it impacts their work and what do they think is the way forward. So I'm pleased to first introduce Esther Oketch. Esther is the Executive Director and Programs Coordinator of the Kenya Female Advisory Organization. She is an African feminist with vast experience in gender and development work, with a focus on intersectional and intergenerational feminist movement building in the region. Her interest in gender transformative budgeting is key in budget analysis and pushing for policy change at the community level with those who are duty bearers in Kenya. And her work looks at ensuring that the devolved functions in Kenya are centered on people and that the policy frameworks are driven by people. I'm also really pleased to introduce Paul Kuria. Paul is currently the Director of Programs and Research at the National Gender and Equality Commission, which is a constitutionally established body that's responsible for promoting gender equality and freedom from discrimination in Kenya. He has a background and experience in gender research and metrics, public governance, and social and behavioral change programming. Last but not least, I'm excited to introduce Betty Mugo from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Betty is a gender and social inclusion specialist and has been with USAID for a decade. She leads and coordinates planning, design, and management of gender strategies and actions. And she has a background in gender development, statistics to measure gender-based violence, gender responsive budgeting, and adaptive management. And finally, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Nora O'Connell, and I am the Strategic Advisor for Global Policy, Advocacy, and Campaigns at Save the Children, based in Washington, D.C., and very excited to have the opportunity to be on this panel with these esteemed leaders. So with that, I'm going to get us started. And I first want to just start with a broad question. And I'd like to hear from each of our experts about what their reflections are on the key findings, and what do they think we need to really keep in mind to improve the publication of gender financing data, and more importantly, the engagement around the use of this data. So I'm going to start with Esther, and could you kick us off and share some of your thoughts?
Thank you very much. The findings reflect on what we, as women's rights organization within the region, have been looking at in a space which we call what is the feminomics of the feminist economics of what people are talking about. And the findings very real in the sense that when we look at what is being given for funding, the funding has been reducing for years. The funding for women's rights work has been reducing through the years. So part of it is that we are also asking donors and partners who are working within this particular space, that when you're looking at the report, which shows that 3% of donor funding is what is dedicated to the gender work, Yet the amount of issues which we are looking at, the issues on sexual reproductive health, the issues on women's work in the different spaces like the agriculture, and then the issues of sexual reproductive health and rights for adolescents and women, and even the issues of women with different with different identities, and even the issues of disability. It shows that the funding is reducing, but the needs are increasing. So part of it is that what we're looking at is that how do we then work in a framework, which when we are working with different partners, we are actually looking at the issue of gender financing and actually investing in that area of gender financing. These issues have been talked about in different frameworks in AWID, we talk about it in different meetings in CSW, but beyond talk, how do we implement all these issues which we talk about? How many partners are investing in these particular areas? And part of it is that we're looking at, we need to track how many partners in that database. When we talk about how much, then we look at, when you talked about the issues of the impact, we are looking at the impact. Is it the impact which government is saying, or the impact which community members are also talking about? So when we look at how much resources has actually gone into the areas where we have engaged in, we must have a matrix which is able to tell us and which community members are able to contribute to. Because one of the things is that, of course, for example, if it's for us as an institution, Kefiado will definitely say that we funded 10 women's rights organizations, and we'll have data on that and how much money was, how many meetings. But the fact is that it's the community who we claim to be working with actually feeling the impact of whatever it is that we are doing. So for me as a feminist, what I'm saying is the voice, the power and the action which we are looking at must really come from the community itself. So part of it is that we need to go a little bit lower and say that, okay, if we as Kefiado, for example, got $100,000, for example, how can we then show in a matrix that $100,000 changed lives, whether it is at household level, and the stories of change which then come from that community then can be looked at. So when we look at all this, I think beyond just the numbers, the data, what is the qualitative data and what are the stories? What is the faces beyond that data, which then can tell us where we need to go to and ensure that the government is then planning, which they do, that then these stories help in the planning. So part of it is that we then engage at a level that when planning is done at the national and then at the sub-county level, then we are able to then ensure that the planning reflects the needs of communities, and the reports by government, which is then shared, is actually then reporting on the projects which then are enabling communities to engage a whole lot more holistically. So for me, that is something which is of interest in the data of what was invested in communities by government in the different projects from the sectors, and what community members are actually saying is the impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. And I think you described a really powerful circle or cycle, like how is the data and the stories and the community engagement used to then drive planning, and then how is it then the implementation of the planning then monitored by the same stakeholders? And I think that that piece, the data isn't just at one point in the process, but in fact data is about engagement, and it's actually a continuous cycle. I think is really a powerful point. Paul, what are your thoughts on kind of the data that we heard Jamie talk about, and what we need to do to improve the engagement around the data, and more importantly around the change for gender equality?
Thank you, Nora. And I just want to echo the few words that came from Easter. First of all, I'm not surprised by the results. This is quite expected. In 2012, 2013, I think, the UN Women did indicate that about 5% of the total aid was targeted to gender as a principle, to gender equality as a principle. And therefore, then it was 5%, we are talking about 3% now. So the range is, plus or minus, one can always estimate that this is almost remaining constant over time. But by and large, this data provides us, or the report provides us with a baseline information, so to speak, that accountability institutions like the National Gender Equality Commission and implementing agencies, and there are many of them, whether they are non-state actors, they are foundations, international development organizations, or the women rights organizations, or just the citizens at large, particularly the special interest groups where women are included, may be able to know what exactly is happening as far as the gender equality architecture is concerned. The financing, the gender financing architecture needs a total, reform. We need much more innovations. We need much more transformation of it, so that we move away from just providing the resources without remaining accountable. And without providing data for it. So in my view, these findings really provides the country with a starting point of a conversation around the gender financing, the importance of gender equality, and asking ourselves, what is the return in the investments that we have seen so far? Yes, 3% might not be seen to be so much, it might be seen to be too little, but also we need to ask ourselves, what is the return for investments for each of the dollar that has gone into the gender equality issues or gender equality programming? The other thing it talks about to us is about the need to not only invest on gender equality programming, but most importantly, also invest in generation of data, utilization of that data, demanding that data. And I'm, as Easter is talking about, how do we demand that data to be much more available in a much more comprehensive manner, not only to the planners, not only to the budget practitioners, but also to the right holders as well, beyond the duty bearers as well, beyond the funding agencies, beyond the philanthropists and the foundations. The citizens as well need to know how much has been provided and how much is going to what components of women economic empowerment, production sectors, and generally gender equality programming. The other thing is that this tells us a story around predictive funding, of gender equality programs. We need to have, as a country, we must be certain of what resources do we need. We need to have the targets as well. And we need to put, and then find some resources. And ultimately, we should be saying that every year we have a certain proportion of our budget that is going to finance gender equality. Now, that does not happen all the time, even when we do know that we have a national policy on gender development. And more often than not, we do not know how much of those resources really support each of the pillars of our policy on gender equality. So to me, the results are not surprising. Hearing the first finding that the majority of our stakeholders and actors on gender equality were dissatisfied with the availability of the data, how much, the quality of the data, the scope of the data, the limitations of the data, and much importantly, to what extent is that data being used to inform future programming and interventions around gender equality. Over to you, Nora. Those are my initial thoughts, so I'm sure we'll be getting into larger conversations later.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing both your thoughts and your passion for this topic. And so with that, we're going to turn to Betty from USAID. And Paul talked about how he didn't find this data shocking or surprising. And so when you heard this data, how did it resonate with you? Was this new to you? Or is it sort of more of the same? And how do you think USAID might approach using this for greater engagement with local actors around data?
Thank you very much. Please allow me first to congratulate Publish What You Fund for launching these gender financing reports. I think this is a great milestone and an important resource for us as we continue to engage on this important conversation. I would also like to thank my fellow panelists for the issues that they're bringing forward. It is indeed an honor to share this panel with yourselves, but also to hear the rich insights that you bring on board. Now, what is evident is that without accurate data, it is very difficult to hold each other accountable. So not just holding government accountable, not holding development partners accountable, but holding each other accountable, which is an important part of how we prioritize gender equality work and investments. Of course, the mapping of national and international gender equality funding flows is an important first step. And so these reports are an important first step on how we improve transparency around gender financing. Obviously, with the evidence that we have in front of us, it is evident that data and evidence are important levers for tracking. They are also important levers for us to be able to report the results, as well as for mutual accountability, like I mentioned. And therefore, it means that we still have a lot more work to do in terms of engaging with each other, particularly engaging with Kenyans in formats that are much more relevant to them. Perhaps the methods that are utilized, including the dashboards that we have, perhaps may not be speaking to the audiences in formats that are useful to them. And so the next most important step then would be to make sure that we are utilizing gender financing data in formats that communities can engage with, and communities can actually question, communities can utilize this information to hold not just partners accountable, but also to hold their governments accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Betty. And I think I've heard from each of the panelists the importance of using the data, and not just using it as leaders, but really that point about community engagement and accountability came out so strongly from each of you in different ways. And Easter, I'm going to turn back to you. You talked a lot about that, again, that sort of cycle and how that community engagement and accountability needs to be woven in sort of at all phases, from planning to implementation, and the importance of who people are accountable to, and really taking an intersectional lens for that. When you look at your work, how would you like to engage with the Kenyan government and with donors so that this sort of vision that you've laid out can happen, or at least move forward?
As an institution, we are already engaging with government, because we work at different levels with what we call the Gender Sector Working Group, which includes government and other civil society groups. And that one, we at national level, we are able to engage at that level. But for us, we feel it's a privilege, because then we have had the privilege of engaging at that level and at sub-county level. But not all persons who need to be sitting in these spaces actually sit in these particular spaces. And it was not also easy to break that space where you're able to sit and have your engagement very holistic. So part of it is that if we want to look at this, we were saying that in terms of access, there's data which for us, we are able to access from county government, for example, with the county government of Kisumu, because we work with them in different spaces, or even with the county government of Siaya, we work with them in those particular spaces. But not all women's rights organizations are able to have what we call the privileges that we have. And not all organizations are then able to sit in that spaces where you can get access to this data, and you can get access to government. So one of the challenges is that we are asking, how do we then also ensure that government makes itself available? A number of times they are not. So for us who work also with women with different disabilities, one of the challenges is that the offices are not very friendly to the different disabilities that you have. Or even when you're looking at which department of statistics where you want to get access, it is not available physically, and it is not supported enough to be able to give the gender data that we require. So usually then we rely on, for example, data from the UN Women, which then we get. So those are the gender data sheets, which then often are used. And the challenge is that the gender data sheets are often used, but the officers who are supposed to be using these data sheets are not even aware those data sheets exist. So part of it is that we need to have a very seamless communication strategy, which when information is then generated by government, because it's a partnership, that data should be available to the officers who are supposed to use it. So part of it, what we are looking at is that when we are looking at government, is that we are asking government, why can't we have simple gender directorates, which then are able to enable different departments to get that gender data, because from each sector, the data can be shared at that particular level, and then we are able to then engage much more holistically. So part of what we are looking at is that in Kisumu County, for example, there's a committee of an intersectoral committee which looks at issues of data. But unfortunately, because of the issues of patriarchy, there's no support for those types of groups. So there's just a group with no financing to help them do their work. So part of it is that if we are able to then look at what we want to access, the data, the Department of Statistics within the different counties should be able to work with the department, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, so that this data is fresh and can be regenerated. And then in terms of engaging government, we need to look at government and ask both national and county governments to invest in the issue of gender disaggregated data in planning, and to ensure that participation of women and girls and people who live with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities, are able to engage, and ensure that the documents which we are using, for example, to even participate in these processes are in the languages which, as Jane was saying, languages. The documents are not in Braille, for example. So if we are even having documents which are being shared, the documents are exclusionary because they're not in languages which people use. When the data goes out, government does not invest in, for example, the issues of sign language interpreters, so it's exclusionary. So part of it, even in the engagement of elderly persons in these particular spaces. So part of it is that there's a lot of focus on youth, and people forget that everybody is going to go to the elderly side, and we do not include how then we can include elderly persons in this conversation. So those are some of the things which, when you're talking about access, elderly people have their needs. So what about the gender data for elderly people and what they need in the spaces where we are? So those are some of the things which we want to ask both government and even civil society to start engaging a whole more holistically on the different intersections of people as they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Eastern. I think you've given some very concrete ways that the data could be generated, communicated, used, and be made much more accessible and usable by different people in Kenya. Paul, when you look at this, this data and some of the steps that have been laid out, what do you think that the government of Kenya can do to ensure improvements going forward? And what do you think is needed by civil society and also international donors to support that?
Thanks. Let me begin with the first part of the question, and I hope I'm audible. Let me begin with the first part of the question. What needs to be done by the state? And here we are talking about gender is a concurrent function. That is both the function of the national government and the subnational governments or the county governments. Definitely, the National Gender Equality Commission, plus many actors, whether it's a women rights organization, non-state actors, whether we are talking about the Kenya Women Parliamentarian Association, and the county assemblies, have developed some simple guidelines on gender financing within the context of what you might want to call the gender responsive budgeting. Now, these guidelines exist too, and I see a huge disconnect between having the guidelines, and that is theory, and the practice itself, applications of those. I do know that the Council of Governors as well, which is a government agency that is responsible and coordinates the matters related to the county governments, 47 of them, have equally developed some simple checklists. They are simple as to stick onto the wall, and they're simplified in a manner that the budget practitioners, whether it is the directors for finance, the directors for gender, the director for economic and social cultural rights, that is going to be anchored in various ministries or departments within the county governments, can use those checklists to formulate gender responsive budgets, gender responsive plans and execution plans as well, and most importantly, how to measure progress that they are making towards closing the gender gap. So to start with, these are initial baby steps that the states and the county governments need to execute. They need to pick those guidelines. We need to start implementing them. It's not easy. I'm not saying this is something that we can do tomorrow. It's complicated because we would need to build the capacity of the various budget practitioners right from in various stages of budget formulation. At the same time, we also have the right holders on the other side, who need to put pressure, who needs to demand for certain priorities and needs and demands that goes to gender equality to be included in any of the annual budgets that the country will be putting forth, or the county governments will be putting forth, or even particularly when you go to the ministries, departments, and agencies. That does not happen all the time. And so we need to start building their capacities as well. We need to sensitize them about gender financing. It's not as easy as we put it in here. Gender financing is a concept, and because it's something that we need to plan for. Unfortunately, that has not happened consistently. At the National Parliament, and the National Parliament here, we're talking about the bicameral house. The county governments as well have the legislative arm, which is the county assemblies, also needs to understand what is gender financing and how it leads to the it closes the gender gaps and importance of investment with
I'm not hearing Paul. Are others hearing Paul?
No, unfortunately not.
Let's see, I think he's just, oh no, he's turned off his camera. Paul, are you still with us? Can you hear us? Well, while Paul figures out his internet connection, I'm going to turn to Betty, and I know Paul will have another chance to.
Hello, Nora.
Hi, Paul, welcome back.
Oh, sorry. I anticipated that I'll get lost at some point. The other elements, institutionalization of gender financing, is so critical across all structures of governance. The counter governments, for instance, in Kenya have come up with the regional economic blocks, which is machinery or frameworks for investments and collating opportunities across several counties. We have 6 of them so far, and the introduction of gender financing and investments on gender equality in such new governance structures or economic structures is so important, such that we move away from just the conventional way of investing in gender equality to much more innovative spaces that exist within our country. We also have the women rights advocates or the gender advocates, and the report alludes to that we need to speak much more, and we need to have a closer conversation and connection and a network between the state and the non-state, and the gender advocates, so that the gender financing moves.
I think we've lost Paul again, but with an insecure connection. So I think we're going to turn to a question for you, Betty. And also we're starting to get questions in the Q&A. So please, just a reminder to folks, we want to hear from you. So feel free to post your questions in the chat or again on Twitter with the hashtag #GenderFinance. So Betty, you've heard from Paul and Easter about some of the things that they think could be done to make the data more accessible, more transparent, more usable. Can you talk about how USAID works with civil society and government, and how particularly do you work with them around gender data, and what are ways that you think you might take some of these recommendations forward?
Thank you very much, Nora. Let me start by saying that the United States government is very much committed to working with Kenyans across the board to promote gender equality and women's empowerment, particularly towards supporting Kenya towards its own journey of self-reliance and prosperity. We have partnered with private sector. We have partnered with civil society. We continue to partner also with public sector in order to achieve the jointly defined development objectives that are very well outlined in our country development cooperative strategy, which is our 5-year plan for implementation in the country. Now, these objectives and the development objectives in that strategy were compiled through a rich analysis using both qualitative and quantitative data to help us to be able to define Kenya's development challenges. Went out, spoke to Kenyans about these development challenges. And so we are confident that we are actually addressing the challenges that are evident that Kenyans can relate to and which government also has prioritized. I must also mention, just like Esther mentioned, that we are working through the government coordination mechanism, which is the Gender Sector Working Group, which is the coordination framework that's used to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in the country. Now, the Gender Sector Working Group is, as you might well know, is chaired by the Cabinet Secretary for Public Service and Gender, as well as the chair of the Development Partners Gender Group. Currently, this chair is the EU, and USAID co-chairs this Development Partners Gender Group. What we have done as development partners together with government, we have mapped out all our investments. And we have mapped up this investment using the priorities and the commitments of the government of Kenya. We have provided this information for purposes of better coordinating our own commitments with those of the government of Kenya. This information is available to the government of Kenya. They're utilizing it for conversations with ourselves. They're utilizing it within the framework of the Gender Sector Working Group. What this mapping has also done is that it has also increased, visibility of our own funding and the funding of other partners, and so that we are able to close gaps that exist. We are able to limit duplication of resources, duplication of effort. So this is an important part of the joint work that we are all doing under the Gender Sector Working Group. We are confident that using this mapping exercise, then we can come together to make sure that we are able to plug in wherever there are any gaps, wherever they exist, and therefore we can better utilize the resources that are available. Part of this mapping exercise, I must also mention, has been also a collation of existing analysis that have been conducted or completed by various partners. And now we are moving towards sharing this, not just the analysis, but also working together to pool resources to conduct analysis jointly with the government of Kenya. So we are very much committed to the priorities and the commitments the government has outlined in their strategic plan, those that they have outlined within the Gender Sector Working Groups, and we are trying to align this with our own priorities and commitments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Betty. And it's really interesting to hear about that level of coordination and mapping. And a question actually came in through the chat box that is quite interesting, because we often think of the government as being the data generators, and we think of communities as being data users, or as well as government leaders. And actually this question kind of flipped the paradigm, and it actually said there's small charities working on the ground in Kenya who actually have data about what's going on in these communities. How do they feed their data into these gender equality projects to government officials or other relevant organizations, so that as you guys are doing this that national kind of coordination or analysis is happening, it benefits from this. So Esther, I don't know if you want to take a first stab at that, or others.
Yeah, citizen-generated data is something which is very critical for government to work with. One of the challenges that government is that there's very many frameworks and portals which then are supposed to be utilized, which citizens do not have access to. So part of it is that what we have been also challenging government is that how do you then ensure that citizens-generated data can be put in frameworks which then can be utilized, because it enriches data which government uses to engage. And if it has been a push, and there have been discussions even with civil society on how to then ensure that we do peer reviews, because part of it is that the framework of citizens generated data is that how do you synthesize that data to ensure that the data can be traced, the data can be utilized in whatever framework that it is, and that community members then can then be able to ensure that whatever it is that is put in, they ask for, is actually utilized by government. And that is why there's been a lot of challenges within when counties are doing their their work on budgets, because half the time communities say that what they asked for is never included in the processes. So part of it is that how does community and government work together in a framework, which then when community members share information that they want to be included, government actually then ensures that it is actually utilized. But one of the challenges of that one is that there's a lot of politics within these particular spaces, because whenever the politicians who pass the budgets are sitting in certain spaces, there's what the executive will propose, which includes what the community wants. And then there's what the county assemblies will want to do, which then we have the challenges that half the time the county assemblies throw out whatever it is that community members want, and you get some tiny tidbits of budgets which are never implemented in any way. So part of it is that when we're looking at this one, we're actually requesting government that, it's not even a request, I think it's a demand, that we have to have codes, because the codes within the budgets is what then will ensure that gender is actually included. So when we're looking at what are the codes of gender, what are the gender data, which then ensures that when we're talking about sectors, that the codes which government gives actually then ensure that we have that budget. And then that the program-based budgets, which then are done, which projects are actually aligned to what people want, which then we can say that this is what the women from this particular area asked for, and they're actually included in those particular budgets. So when we're talking about this one, government has been talking about program-based budgeting, but sometimes when they talk about those program-based budgeting, they're not actually inclusive of what citizens want. So it is important for us to be able to engage on that. And Paul, as we are talking about the issue of the regional blocks, one of our bit is that where is the gender in those regional blocks? All the key areas where financing is being done is very male dominated. So part of the areas where we are saying that is that space is supposed to be engaging on, then we do not want to have a women and development approach. It's supposed to be a gender and development approach. So that then when we are talking about what the regional blocks are saying, in all the sectors which then the people are talking about that they're going to be investing in, it is not supposed to be tokenism. So part of what we are looking at is that the tokenism on these particular areas then ensures that you're given some marginalized space for you to be able to sit, and it's never included in these particular spaces. And finally, when I'm speaking, it also has to look at that when we're talking about the issue of practice and culture, what are we looking about the issues of gender, diversity, and identity? Because in terms of the different issues of gender, one of the cultural issues is that we are very fearful to talk about the issues of gender identity and the different sexualities which come about and the different needs of the different people. So the homogeneous way when we are looking at the issues of gender data still is exclusionary. So part of it is that if we are able to engage with NGEC on the issue of this, that we look at the issue of the markers, the gender markers, which then identify different persons, and not only think that when we put intersex, that is we have made a major step in the terms of our engagement on issues of gender, then we need to then start looking at those particular areas. That in the terms of the gender markers, what are the different gender identities which then we need to include? And NGC is capable of ensuring that we push these particular issues so that then when we come to the different issues on practice and culture, then we are actually looking at gender data which addresses the different identities of persons and their needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Easter. And a couple questions have come up, but we're also getting close to time. So what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to put the questions out there, but also ask each of the panelists if you want to just have like a 1 minute sort of closing remark, and if you want to build the answers to these questions into your closing remarks. So one of the questions kind of builds on that citizen generated data, which is what can donors do more to support that kind of data. But the other one actually links to a little bit that we've heard about is like, how do we have better connections between the community and the people who are talking about data? A couple of you have talked about the accessibility of those conversations. And one of the follow-up questions to Betty, your comments about donor coordination is that analysis and mapping that is happening at that high level, is that being shared transparently so that community advocates can also access that data? So As you can see, there's a lot of interest in continuing this conversation, and want to put those out there. Folks are able to address them in their closing remarks. And I'm going to flip the order in the closing. And first, I'm going to turn to you, Paul, because I know we lost you a bit on earlier, and hopefully your internet is strong now so people can hear you now.
My apologies that at some point I got lost, and I'm back. Well, I just want to speak to the questions that you have raised, but in a much more broader way, and say the following: that the non-state actors as well as the government agencies have a responsibility of ensuring that, one, we generate relevant, timely data that will speak to gender equality and will show us the progress we are making in the investments on gender programming. But much more importantly, the states, and particularly the government statistical frameworks. In Kenya, we have the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and and we have very good relationship with them, Bureau as well, which has been providing us with the capacity on disaggregation of data by gender, is to open up the space and the opportunities and create much more opportunities for community or citizen-driven data, so that we are, so that as much as we provide standards and framework within which those that data should be provided, and the criteria and the measures within which it should comply with, we should be able to accept such data and test it. And over time, we should be able to utilize that data. Most importantly is that when we collect all this data, we begin telling the conversation on what the country is doing, what are the lessons learned, where are we not doing well, and where we have done very well, what are some of the lessons, and what are some of the items that we can scale up and replicate. The gender responsive policy, I think it's high time we have an amendment to our law so that we can give sanctions and rewards, particularly to the ministries and departments and agencies that are really, setting aside a significant amount of their resources towards the gender equality. Just enough for the development partners to push resources to the state, but also how the state utilizes those resources to meet the issues of gender equality. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul. And next I'm going to turn to Betty.
Thank you very much for this question. Let me say this. We have a lot of opportunity to strengthen partnerships at all levels. If we could strengthen the partnership at the citizen level, connecting those partnerships with local governments, connecting those partnerships with the institutions that are responsible for generating data. If we could strengthen those partnerships and those relationships, then we can find an entry point in order for us to leverage the opportunities that exist to better utilize citizen data. We might also want to strengthen the capacities of not just citizens, but also of government to be able to be more receptive, to be able to better utilize, strengthen not just the capacities of schools that are standard, but also for what a better way to do this other than through the. There might also be other opportunities, higher learning and research organization, work community-based organizations to be able to knowledge and skills are evident in across the the continent towards this much.
Thank you so much, Betty. And Easter, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds for what's the one sentence or idea you want to just put in people's minds before we close.
Cross movements work with what different people are doing so that we have different engagements at that level, and ensure that the community action groups can be formed so that it's community driven. So how do we get community action groups to engage across the different movements? And that one will ensure that different movements are able to generate information that can then be utilized for the different sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so I just want to, as we close out, just to remind folks that we know that today was actually, we were going to say a conversation starter, but it's clear there's a very active conversation and a lot of work happening around this in Kenya. So hopefully this research will be a moment that helps accelerate and support a lot of the progress that we know many of these leaders and others are already committed to making happen. We also want to let folks know that we're going to be releasing a global transparency report, Publish What You Fund, bringing together the findings from not only the research in Kenya, but also Nepal and Guatemala to see what those lessons can be learned from that. So we encourage folks to stay tuned for that conversation as well. And just thank everyone for taking the time to be here today, but in particular, to Easter, to Paul, to Betty for your expertise and engagement. And our appreciation to Publish What You Fund for really elevating the data and showing it to us from different angles and sparking this important conversation. So thank you all.